Hello, this is a short walkthrough video of our meeting on January 20th, where we talked about the methods portion of the engaged teaching model and facilitating discussions. So we began by looking at our engaged teaching model workshop series that we've been doing together this calendar year, academic year, and we're in the methods section, and we've had two meetings so far in January, one about lecturing effectively, which was on January 13th. And then on the 20th, we talked about facilitating discussions, and we have 4 more meetings left this academic year. And we had a quick agenda. Of course, we're revisiting the knowing what, knowing how, and knowing why portion of the engaged teaching model. And again, the meeting today was about discussions. So we talked about what and how we describe discussions, why we might include discussions in our classes, and how we can have engaging discussions with our classes. And since we're on a new semester, and we revisited the 2 authors of the engaged teaching model, and we took a quick look at the interactive lecturing book, just referencing that as one of the pieces that was a part of our first meeting this January on the 13th. And then we shared a quote from them about discussions. The biggest challenge to generating discussions is fostering an environment where students of any background feel empowered to express their thoughts openly and candidly. So in revisiting the authors that have been guiding, or educational researchers that have been guiding our engaged teaching series, this particular week we were pulling in some educational researchers who have written quite a bit and studied discussion as a way of teaching. And I call them the 2 Stevens, Stephen Brookfield and Steven Pressfield. And I shared a link to a podcast that is very interesting that Steven Brookfield did for the Inside Higher Ed podcast that you may want to check out. And then I shared something from Steven Pressfield that appeared in the Chattanooga newspaper. It was a book review of his book, Education in Black and White. And it was about his work with his writing center and Highlander Center, and the Highlander Center in this area of East Tennessee. So we share those work about the 2 Stevens, and then I summarized what we can find in their writing about the role, discussion's role on improving learning. So I broke down their model into different sections, and we had a quick walkthrough of this model. So they said what they've learned through studying discussion, that the benefits to it in your classroom are to expose students to a variety of viewpoints and allow them to analyze their biases through having discussion with others, meaning that they're able to communicate their ideas, and they've learned to do that through discussion. And connect, and it also helps their brain connect the subject area of the course to life experiences. So we know the brain's a pattern-seeking device. So having discussion helps the brain build patterns to experiences they may have had, and to new and novel ideas. Also, having discussion as part of our classes helps students develop active listening skills, empathy towards others, and then until what they call intellectual agility. So being able to think, listen, and think about what it is that they're hearing. And of course, the 2 Stevens are very interested into democracy and discussion, and so they're saying students gain respect for voices and perspectives of others when we include discussion, and it helps them to be able to internalize the habits of democratic discourse. So these are reasons why it may be important to have discussion in our class settings, but we also know that there are obstacles to implementing discussion effectively. So at this point in our meeting, we broke out into breakout rooms, and we spent about 12 minutes or so in breakout rooms talking about obstacles that have occurred with us to implementing discussion effectively. Then we came back into the main Zoom room and shared what some of those challenges have been, and we were able to listen to each other and synthesize this information as to ways that we can think about meeting or exceeding some of our challenges and discussion in the classroom. So we bridge next to understanding the different types of discussion. So now we're back to our Barkley and Major speaking about the engaged teaching model. So we described discussion as we can have whole group discussion, small group, dyads. Research tells us that the smaller the group, the more likely students are going to be able to contribute. It may be easier for them to get into deeper conversations. Sometimes we can think of discussion groups as in terms of their function. So there are informal discussions, problematical discussions where we might ask groups to solve a problem, look for solutions in their group. And we might have a discussion in which the students are looking at differing points of view and sharing that dialogue to support a particular viewpoint. We also might have a reflective discussion where we're asking students to put their own positionality into the situation and share that back with the group. If we think about discussions in terms of structure, there are spontaneous discussions, there are planned discussions. And one thing we know is that having a discussion in your classroom can be a challenge if we don't plan for differing points of view, if we don't know the content well ourselves. We may feel less confident in having something like a spontaneous discussion. So we talked about proactively in the group about what we might want to consider when we think about the structure of discussion. Of course, you can think of discussion in terms of environment, thinking about it as on-site or on-ground or face-to-face discussions, and then teaching online, teaching live synchronously or asynchronously recorded. What do we want our discussions to look like? And we talked about different things that people have done in our group with regard to face-to-face and on-site discussions. And then we talk about components of discussion. Oftentimes what we may be familiar with is initiation, response, evaluation, IRE, where the faculty member or the instructor is going to initiate a discussion, gather responses from people in the meeting or class, and then evaluate their response. Like interesting point, we might also think about, and then interteaching. So when they were giving ownership to students to prepare and teach portions of a topic that they've researched, discussed. So we can involve students in the generation of content and the discussion format. It increases learning. Okay, so then we looked at some knowing why, again, our research on discussion, and what are some things that can help, some tips that can help foster great discussions and brain compatible discussions and culturally responsive discussions. So we know that active preparation improves outcomes. Like we discussed earlier, when you ready yourself for different points of view, for questions that might arise in the content, when you plan for where the discussions will fit as part of your class time, it increases the benefits of discussion. We know that discussion in small groups can increase participation. So thinking about what size you want your discussion groups to be can help increase engagement. and that participation is improved by assessment, whatever you mean by assessment in your classroom. So assessment for some means that there's always a grade attached to it. Assessment for others means credit. Assessment in other places mean acknowledgement and an ungrading structure. So, but we know that when there's some deliverable attached to participation, it increases involvement. Sense of belonging improves with participation. So having a discussion agreement, a speaking agreement with your students that you develop together can help improve sense of belonging and decrease barriers to engaging or concerns about engaging in class discussion. And then there's some interesting research about cold calling or calling on participants in the classroom. Even though it is maybe a contested form of discussion and response, it can improve learning, and it actually, research supports that it can improve comfort or sense of belonging as along with voluntary participation when practiced. So one way we talked about doing that was helping students ready for being called on. So we begin a topic, we want to know more about it. We help the students prepare before coming to class for the discussion, and then involving them actively. Over time, it increases voluntary participation and also sense of belonging. We talked about in our group, it's because it can feel more equitable when there's the expectation that we're all going to participate in some way. Okay, so then we had another discussion. We did this as a live chat discussion. So what do I do with hot moments? So Barkley and Major in the Engaged Teaching Model talk about what they call hot moments during discussions, moments of tension, moments of difficult conversation, and what are some things that can help with that. So we had a chat where people shared different methods that or things that they do when a hot topic comes up, or there are hot moments in the discussion. And it was interesting because it really lined up with what Barkley and Major had written about, which is kind of synthesized in this graphic. First, they say wait, and then remind the class of our topic, of hopefully you have a discussion agreement plan in place that you can point to, and breathe. Invite the students to breathe yourself, take a moment, pause, wait, remind, connect them to the topic area that we are, or the learning outcomes for that day, and help to clarify what it is that is being heard. State, I'm hearing this, and then ask, is that correct? And invite discussion in a thoughtful and mindful way. Then we ended off our time together by kind of pivoting from these things that has been shown to increase the engagement and discussions, and pulling in some other factors if we're talking about online discussions, so online teaching. So aside from actively preparing what your discussions are going to be and having it improve outcomes, be clear with the learning goals. So in an online course, and particularly asynchronously, saying and communicating with students in multiple ways and being clear about your expectations for discussion in the course is very important. Think about synchronous versus online component and what that's going to look like. Try to include as many synchronous or live opportunities as possible, because participation is improved by some sort of synchronous component. So if there's an equitable way to infuse live virtual meetings into your course, that will increase discussion following in an asynchronous manner or accompanying. Establish clear guidelines. Again, those agreements that you form with class at the beginning and revisit frequently, particularly in an online course, helps increase engagement. And then lastly, be present in the discussion. So your participation, not just through typing a response, say, to a discussion board, but particularly in an online discussion, your active participation will increase engagement. And then we ended off our meeting looking at our map again and planning ahead for our next meeting, which will be on the 27th. And it's our last piece of the method series, and it's implementing collaborative learning. So I hope to see you then.